G'day, I'm Owen. This is the pub test. And if you are a new viewer here, welcome. And for all you returning viewers, welcome back. Now I know there's new viewers here because YouTube says that 70% of people every month are new to this channel. But I will give you a warning. If this is your first video here and you're not familiar with the Jack the Ripper saga, you might just get a little bit lost in it. But for the 30% of you returning, well, many of you I would actually consider experts in this subject. Whilst we might have different opinions, I know that you're very aware of the people we're going to name in this video, because it's quite a long list. This is not focusing on one suspect, but the overall Jack the Ripper crimes. Now, why I chose to do this video right now is because there is talk of a new inquest actually starting again 130 years after the crimes happened because of some DNA evidence. So as I understand, it's getting a little bit of DNA evidence and then pinning all the crimes on the one person. But the problem we have here is, I think that's the wrong way of going about it. Because many people would say it wasn't just 5 victims. It was a lot more, stretching back earlier into the 1880s and probably continuing right up until the 1900s. And then you also had the Thames torso crimes happening at the same time. And some say it was the same perpetrator, Jack the Ripper, did the Thames torso crimes too. Now, without getting into that argument fully, I think we can all agree that violent crime was happening in the London area before Jack the Ripper, and it continued well after Jack the Ripper and still is happening today. So could some of these crimes have been copycats? Now, not in the way we normally think of someone trying to emulate the perpetrator of a particular series of crimes, but rather could they be hiding their nefarious deeds under the guise of Jack the Ripper? Well, it might surprise you, but that has happened in the past. And we're going to look at that. But then we will be looking at many of the usual suspects that get mentioned. We'll have Lechmere, Robert Donston Stevenson, Ed Buchan, Joe Barnett, Thomas Cutbush, Francis Thompson, George Hutchinson, and possibly more. Could any or all of them have committed some of these crimes? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now let's first look at that idea of a copycat killer. Now, previously in this channel, I have looked at the comparison between Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. But then it was brought to my attention in comments there was probably someone very much closer to the style of Jack the Ripper and also in time as well, but in a different country, the Atlanta Ripper. He performed his crimes between 1909 to 1914. And for a time there, it was said that he was performing about 1 attack every week. But there is a difference in the type of people the Atlanta Ripper attacked. Unlike our good friend in Whitechapel, who was going after the unfortunates, taking advantage of their misfortune, the Atlanta Ripper attacked quite well-presented women. They were working. They weren't out on the street. Many of them had good jobs with families. And yes, the Atlanta Ripper himself was also never caught, so we don't know the motive behind the crimes. But what is interesting is that 2 people gave a description of who this bloke was, in that he was African American himself and quite neatly dressed. Now, all his victims were African American. Now, I would suggest, and I'm fairly certain of this, that in Atlanta, around the 1900s, there was a fair bit of segregation. So if a white bloke had have gone into that area of Atlanta, he would have stuck out like anything. But a well-dressed person of the same colour skin as everyone else in the area would blend in quickly. And it's said that the people that have claimed to have seen Jack the Ripper, and we're going to look at a couple of them in this video, suggested that it was a well-presented person, someone that maybe be able to just walk past the police without raising suspicion. And that's the point, really, isn't it? Because if someone looks nefarious, well, they're going to get stopped by the police, thrown to the ground, probably searched. But if you're business dressed, well, you probably just be able to walk on by. But the important thing here, and why I bring up the Atlanta Ripper, is that it was proven that some blokes in Atlanta at the time decided, you know what, I could get away with the wife. Yeah, or the girlfriend. Because all I have to do is attack them in the way this other bloke is, and they'll think it's the Atlanta Ripper. What a ripper of an idea. And yes, ripper in Australia means something good. It sounds absolutely atrocious on the surface of it, but it was proven that at least 4 victims at the Atlanta area at the time were done by their spouses. Yes, they were victims of domestic violence. These people thought they could just get away with it because it would be hidden amongst all the terror that was going on around Atlanta at the time. And so the question is, could the same thing have happened with Jack the Ripper? Did some blokes think, well, I could probably get away with a few crimes right now because the police are looking for someone else? And I start by looking at Francis Coles, what some people believe is an official victim of Jack the Ripper, but it happened a couple of years after the hysteria had died down. Now, the bloke that first got suspected of doing that crime was James Sadler. And yes, we've mentioned him on this channel and gone through that whole scenario. But there were differences in her particular attack, in that this time a blunt knife was used, unlike what Jack the Ripper did, and there was no strangulation first. But there were so many similarities that some people suggested it was Jack the Ripper had come back, even though the police had been saying for quite some time now, no, he's gone. We've caught him, or we've locked him up, or he's died. Varying reports of what the police were saying, but the consistent thing was there is no Jack the Ripper anymore. Now, Frances Coles was James Sadler's girlfriend, and he goes on trial for this attack because there's fairly strong circumstantial evidence to suggest he could have been involved, as well as the fact that 9 times out of 10 a woman gets attacked, it's going to be someone very close to her doing the particular crime. But now it's not that he got exonerated or proven to be not guilty. The judge just basically said, we don't have enough to convict. And so he's let go. Because the papers had said, hey, we've now found Jack the Ripper, a lawyer sued the papers and James Sadler got a fair chunk of payout from those papers for a bit of libel. But I can understand why the police back in the day went pretty hard at him to pin him for this attack against Francis Coles. Yet, now there's an interesting thing here, and a tiny bit of a pattern starts to form. In that if the police had said to him, look mate, we know you did that crime. We will be keeping an eye on you. What would you do? Well, you'd probably blend into the background and disappear. Really keep a low profile. And oddly, we know very little about what happened to James Sadler after he celebrated getting the money from the newspapers. And that also is not that uncommon. In fact, there was a bloke, the monster of the Andes, a dude who killed so many young girls in South America. He's officially listed as having 50 victims. Possibly 250. Could even be more. He got caught, convicted, sent to prison, and he must have been some type of angel in prison because in 1998 he was let out after 20 years in prison. To this day, no one knows where he is or where he went. He just blended in. But that is a horrifying story and a pub test for another time. But just the point being that people can just disappear even with massive notoriety. Now, for many of you who watch this channel, you know that I have stated that I believe there's more than one perpetrator for these crimes. But I've also stated many times that the police were hampered by trying to put all 5 of the official crimes together and find one person. But if they had have been looking at the crimes in isolation, would they have come up with different solutions? And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. But work backwards, starting with Mary Kelly. If we took that crime in isolation, who would be a primary suspect? Well, definitely the primary suspect for me would be Joe Barnett. In fact, he drove the bus on the entire investigation into Mary Kelly, because we know so little about her other than what Joe Barnett himself told the police. But what couldn't be denied is that they used to fight pretty big time, because Joe Barnett was Mary Kelly's boyfriend, and they were living at Miller's Court, where Mary Kelly was found. But there was a broken window, he says, from an argument. We can't deny the broken window because that's how they managed to get into the room. But they fought when they got on the drink, but they'd split up only a few weeks, months or so before the attack on Mary Kelly occurred. So could this have been also a domestic violence situation? Well, absolutely. Did he go back there angry because she was now back on the street getting money from blokes for a bit of company, and that just angered him, and then drunk, he lost it, but then to cover up the crime did what he did inside that room, which was make the body virtually unrecognizable. Now, I've also covered different scenarios about what happened in Miller's Court on this channel, but just assuming for this one that it was Mary Kelly there, well, Joe Barnett has to be top of the list. Now, being a fish porter, he definitely had some knife skills, and he also had some knives. He was also coming back to Miller's Court that very morning before it was officially known who had been attacked. And he said, a relative told me that something happened to Mary Kelly, or at least at Miller's Court, and he was rushing down there to find out. I'm not sure if that was ever corroborated by the police. They did interview him for 4 hours. But they said, well, we'll have to let him go. We've got no evidence. It's not to say that they didn't think he was involved. It's just that they couldn't definitely prove it. Now, considering the police had arrested quite a few people up to this point, and then thought, well, they can't have done the other crimes because they're incarcerated at the moment or in an asylum, so they let them go. So they may have been a bit reluctant just to throw another bloke into prison, particularly someone who was presenting not as an insane person, someone who had been gainfully employed and will probably pick up a job again soon. So we'll just keep an eye on him. And is it possible that they said to him, we're going to watch you, buddy. We think you had something to do with this. Because similar to James Sadler, Joe Barnett disappears for a good 20 years after this event. No one has any record of where he went or what he was doing, but he does appear back on the scene around Whitechapel 20 years later with another person who it appears that he was then married to. So again, did he get warned off and then just blended into the background? If I was the police, I would be making a strong case for Joe Barnett with this Mary Kelly crime. But then we have George Hutchinson. Now, he mostly only comes into the Jack the Ripper saga at this particular crime. But many people discount George Hutchinson because they say, well, look, he gave such a detailed description of the bloke he saw with Mary Kelly the night of that crime in Miller's Court that it just has to be made up. Yes, he went right down to the type of cufflinks the bloke was wearing and everything like that, despite only getting a glimpse of him for a fraction of a second. But there is something odd about his interaction with Mary Kelly that particular night that does raise a question. And I don't think I've brought this one up before, but he says in that conversation, Mary Kelly's calling him Hutchinson, not George. And I believe he's referring to her by her last name as well. It was a very formal type of situation. She wasn't going up saying, "Hey, Georgie, how you going? Have you got a bit of spare change?" Now, he says he knew Mary Kelly quite well, so why the formality? Well, it has been suggested maybe he was her pimp, remembering that Mary Kelly used to take clients back to her room. That would have elicited quite the premium amount of money. You could charge more for that. And so maybe she did have a manager of sorts. And perhaps she was no longer giving him money. The conversation may not have been, "Hey, Hutchinson, can you give me money?" He may have been asking her. And perhaps because the interaction between them was seen, he had to come up with a story. But then to send a message to all the other people he was managing, he had to go and commit that crime. But then to cover the fact that he was there on the scene, he went back to the police and gave them this fanciful story about seeing Mary Kelly with this bloke and so forth. Now, the police were quite impressed with Hutchinson, and he eluded all suspicion, and also we know little about what happened to him after this event. In fact, we know little about him leading up to this event. He just seems to have popped up out of nowhere and then disappeared. Again, he would be high on my list for this particular crime. But a third person does come on this list, and quite frequently as well, but Robert Donston Stevenson. Yes, the bloke who was in the Whitechapel Hospital, and he was there for the duration of all of these crimes. And when you see where that hospital was, it was fairly central. Now, he could have got out of that hospital. I think that's well proven. So it's not like he was locked down and he was only in there for pain, and you can't prove pain. He could easily get up and maybe take off. And I really think he's the Smokey in all of this. And Smokey in Australia does not mean like the police officers in some parts of the United States, but rather the dark horse. Someone that just might come out of the blue and surprise you. Now, the fact is, we know he was nearby, but also he was well presented. He had the charisma. He could talk quite well. And he had money, which would definitely fit the Mary Kelly situation because, as said, she charged a premium for her services because of the location, and he would probably match the typical client that Mary Kelly would attract. Therefore, have access into the room quite easily, and some of the things that happened in that room also match the occult side of things that people say were going on at that scene. And I have not dived deep into that part of the Robert Donston Stevenson theory, but I will just say, if I was the police, I may have looked at this bloke a little bit more thoroughly. I'm unsure of how much the police actually investigated him back in the day, even though the private investigator he hired to look at a doctor in the Whitechapel Hospital for being Jack the Ripper, well, that the private detective threw Donston Stevenson under the bus, but I don't think they took it all that credibly. But he had the location, and he also had the means, but this won't be the last time he gets mentioned in this particular video. But what about the rest of them? We'll start with Ed Buchan. And yes, that is how you say it, Buchan. Not how I was saying it previously. Thank you, Roger. I think it may have been mentioned to me before as well, but he's not the first person I'm going to mention that I'm going to get the name wrong, and definitely not going to be the last. But anyway, that's how it said, Buchan. I'm not sure that he did this Mary Kelly crime myself, because I don't think he would have been able to access Mary Kelly's room. It's not that he wouldn't have had the money, I just don't think the temperament fits this particular crime of gaining the trust of Mary Kelly. And then I put Lechmere into that category too. I just don't see it. Francis Thompson, he was homeless at the time, even though it's said that he was a friend of Mary Kelly. That is definitely not proven, but again, would she have taken him inside the room? I doubt it. And I put Thomas Cutbush and William Berry into that category as well. Yes, in the area, but just don't see them gaining access to Mary Kelly's room. And then we got James Kelly, a bloke who the police were looking for. They thought he could be doing these crimes. No one knows where he was during this. But again, being on the run and the police looking for you, and at the time with police everywhere, I just don't actually think that he could have been in the area nor got access to Mary Kelly's room. The point is, though, trying to match all these individuals to the crimes that happened previous, I think we're going to find is really tricky. Because let's move on to the next one. Catherine Eddowes, who was found in Mitre Square, which is near Butcher's Row, and I don't think we've even mentioned a single person from that area, and I'm not even sure they make this particular list. But I'd straight away say here that Buchan jumps high on the list of being able to have perpetrated this crime. And you're going to say, Owen, why? Why is all of a sudden this bloke the primary suspect for the Catherine Eddowes crime? Well, we might remember that there were 3 blokes that saw Catherine Eddowes with someone just before she was attacked. And one of the guys, who I've hardly mentioned in this series, Joseph Laundy, many people believe that his description was the one that fitted Jack the Ripper. Even though the other 2 blokes there on that time gave totally differing accounts as well, for some reason, people maintain that Laundy actually was more on the money. But his description was that the bloke had a sailor's appearance. Now, it doesn't really go into that greater detail of what that meant, but he says the guy was around about 30, but was fairly respectable looking. But he said he got as close as 3 meters, but even despite seeing him, he didn't think he would be able to recognize that person again. If in a lineup, he wouldn't be able to pick him out. So despite the fact that Buchan would have been too young to fit the description that Laundy gave, it is possible that Laundy didn't exactly have it 100% accurate. And the sailor's appearance, so it's not fully explained what he meant by that. Buchan working at a marine trader, his father had the marine trader shop, would have had access to all sorts of clothing and could have dressed up in a sailor's appearance. Now, it's important to state at this point, the rest of these crimes, the women, no doubt, chose the location, a spot where they knew they could get privacy to complete the business transaction. So it's safe to say, whoever that person was who was with Catherine Eddowes that night, well, she led them into Mitre Square. Now we get to Robert Donston Stevenson, and this one fits him very, very well, except for the description given by Laundy. So he could have committed the crime there in Mitre Square, ducked out Goulston Street, and then back to the Whitechapel Hospital very quickly and easily. And also, the window of opportunity to perform this crime was about 6 to 7 minutes. And it would be suggested that he actually had the knife skills to be able to do what he did. Then we get to Lechmere. Now, it's suggested he is on the way to work. We're going to get to that, though, because this is the night of the double event. But it said that he could be on the way to work, runs into Catherine Eddowes, who is not long released from prison for being drunk and disorderly. So I'd suggest she was still a little bit affected by the alcohol because she wasn't in there all that long. She just sobered up enough to be able to get kicked out. He performs that crime and then continues on his way to Pickford's. But this crime could have also been committed by Francis Thompson, William Berry, or so many other different ones. Because it's possible the person Laundy saw wasn't the person that committed the crime. Then we get to Joe Barnett, and some people have suggested that because Catherine Eddowes used the name Kelly on occasions, well, he did this crime maybe to cover up the one he was going to commit later against Mary Kelly. But then we move to Elizabeth Stride, and this is where the issue comes in about the same person committing the crimes. Because Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were the victims of the double event. So 2 people on the same night. Could the same person have committed these crimes? Well, yes, it is possible. The time between the attacks is enough for someone to have walked that distance. Now, I know there are professionals in this field that say these serial perpetrators, once they get an idea in their mind, they cannot stop until the crime is complete. And so the fact that it's suggested that Elizabeth Stride and her attack was interrupted, that did not satisfy the desire inside the perpetrator, so they had to go and commit another crime and finish what they started. But I question that. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert in this field, but from what I've seen and what I've read, these serial perpetrators do actually get into some type of character. They can remove themselves from the situation that they're doing to an extent. And then they can get jolted out of that. Like if they're almost caught, they realize, hang on, this isn't good. And they'll often stop what they're doing and go away and plan for another day. It's unlikely, from what I've seen, for someone to actually just have to keep on going that night. Now, as a general rule, these people do not want to be caught. So if they come close to it, as we've seen with James Sadler, the monster of the Andes, and all these other ones, if they're on the radar, they like to go to ground. So I really doubt this built-up need to continue the crime that night. And I point to Lechmere to start with. Yes, could he have committed that crime? Yes, absolutely. But now some people say, well, but he was on the way to work. Now, if that was the case, he left for work very, very early. Because when he found the first official victim, he was on the way to work and he left home around 3 a.m. or a little bit later. Regardless, he certainly wasn't out at midnight trying to find someone to attack. And when it comes to Lechmere, he was the one that found Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, and we haven't got there yet. But it said that he got interrupted by Robert Paul coming down the road, and so then he has that interaction with him. But where was the second victim then that night? Because if he's on his way to work, he didn't get that job done, and he can't help himself, but he's got to perform another crime. Well, there should have been another victim that night. Yet, okay, you'll say, but he was running late now. He couldn't miss his shift, so he didn't have the time to do the crime, which would be fair enough. But what was he doing on this night? Out so early? Was he planning not to get it done? So then he had time to commit another crime. See, to me, it doesn't pass the pub test. But I do accept the fact that he could have been on a day off, because this was a weekend. So maybe he wasn't working that day. But then, and this is where I'm just raising the question, and you let me know what you think. If he was interrupted at Burner Street, at Dutfield's yard, why would he then go further away from his safe haven? Because these people do look for safety. So now you're a bit rattled. You got interrupted with Louis Deemshoots coming in with his horse and cart into Dutfield's yard. Would you not take off and start heading back to your place of residence? Now, I know there will be another question here. People say, but hang on, didn't his mother live closer to Mitre Square? So maybe that was his actual safe haven where he was doing crimes and then going into there. Well, that is a possibility, and I'm not ruling it out. My point here is, yes, it's possible Lechmere could have done both these crimes. But when I sort of just put it all together, I just can't see why he was out so early, and then why he would continue on with this murderous spree when he managed to control it with Polly Nichols. But that's just a thought. But there's more to this Elizabeth Stride crime that does raise questions about whether a single perpetrator could have committed them. We see, it actually couldn't be Lechmere if Matthew Packer, the greengrocer in Burner Street, was actually correct in his description. He said it was a well-dressed person who was with Elizabeth Stride, and he was watching them. Remember, he said they bought grapes from them as well, so the dude had a bit of money because that was quite the expensive item back in those days. Now, despite the fact that Matthew Packer gave quite the detailed description, the police didn't want to listen to him at all. That is a pub test for another time. But interestingly, he didn't give that story initially, but that was later when the hired person for the Vigilance Committee came and said, hey, surely you saw something. So there is skepticism about what he saw that night. But if we accept what he said is true, well, Robert Donston Stevenson now jumps high on the list. 1, he had the money. 2, he was well presented and could talk very well. But then I say, if he did that crime, if he attacked Elizabeth Stride, now Elizabeth Stride also looks like she had defensive wounds, so she may have not have been subdued as quickly as the others and could have fought back just a touch. And it is suggested with some of the marks and everything that perhaps the perpetrator cut themselves as well. But regardless, I don't see Donston Stevenson attacking Elizabeth Stride in Dupfield's yard and then going off to Mitre Square, when he would be going away from his safe haven, being the hospital. I could see him doing this crime and going back to the hospital, absolutely. And he would match Matthew Packer's description. And remember, Matthew Packer said that it was chucking it down so hard with rain that hardly anyone was out on the street, and he was watching these two numpties standing near Dutfield's yard thinking that they're crazy. So if you've now got fairly well soaking wet, I also find it unlikely that you would then start booking it over to Mitre Square to do another attack. But all the others on the list, we got Buchan, we got Cutbush, we got Francis Thompson. Most of them are either too young or not presenting very well. Francis Thompson himself was homeless at the time. But there's a possibility that the perpetrator could have just been hiding in Dutfield's yard. And so after Elizabeth Strider's concluded her business transaction with this well-presented person, someone could have come out of the darkness while perhaps she's getting herself ready to walk away and just get attacked blindly. So then all of a sudden, all those three definitely could come back onto the list. But of all those three, I could feasibly accept that Francis Thompson may have gone to Mitre Square. And I say that because we don't know where he was living. Where was his safe haven? Maybe it was in that area. Remembering people said he was friends with Mary Kelly. So it's possible. The others, like Buchan, I could see going back to the shop, which was in the opposite direction. William Berry lived in the opposite direction. So I could see them doing that crime, but I can't see him having done the other one in Mitre Square. And we get to Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street. 29 Hanbury Street was where her body was found. And very similar to Elizabeth Stride, she was seen with a bloke not long before she was attacked. Now, it was Elizabeth Long who gave the description of the bloke that Annie Chapman was with. And she said he looked foreign and was dressed shabby genteel. I think that's how you say it. And I'm like, well, what on earth is that? Well, it says you are trying to present yourself like a business-style person, but you're a bit not quite there. It'd be like putting on a suit and a shirt and not ironing the shirt and you've got a crushed jacket. People would say, well, that's shabby genteel. But Elizabeth Long did also say that she didn't actually pay that much attention because it was quite common to see blokes and women down Hanbury Street at that time of the morning. So to her, it was just another day. Now let's look at Letchmere. Remembering when he found Polly Nichols, himself and Robert Paul walked up Hanbury Street, and some people say, see, that was his way to work. But it probably wasn't his way to work. It is highly suggested that he was just sort of ghosting Robert Paul, just sort of sussing out where he was going. And Robert Paul himself, worked. His place of work was just up the end of Hanbury Street. So he didn't have far to go at all. Whereas Lechmere had a fair way still to go to Pickford's, and it was unlikely that that was his normal way to work. But it's not to say he couldn't have been in the area for sure. But the timing of this one does make it really awkward to pin him at it, because he would have already had to have been at work. And yes, I will accept the fact that he could have already made it back with his cart and gone and done that crime, because they weren't exactly GPS tracked. And they no doubt had a bit of leeway with their deliveries and so forth. Yes, hard work, but things were going to go wrong, so I don't think the timetable was that pushed. But someone who jumps high on this list for this crime would be Francis Tumblety. Have not mentioned him. Definitely foreign looking. He had a fairly unique style about him, to say the least. Now, knowing he could have very well presented as shabby genteel if he chose to do so, maybe even got rid of that ridiculous mustache that he had, because it's possible that wasn't even real. And the police were really keen to get him back from the United States. But then we could go to the cast of many. Donston Stevenson definitely could be on the list for this one, though it was starting to get a bit bright for him to sneak back into the hospital. Would have thought he probably would want the cover of darkness, but it's not to say that he couldn't have done this crime. And then all the other ones on the list we've mentioned, Buchan, Berry, Francis Thompson, definitely could have been in the area. Then we get to Polly Nichols, and I'm not deep diving into Bucks Row. That has been thrashed pretty hard on this channel so far. But the point is, it's safe to say that Lechmere definitely could have committed this crime. As the first finder, you always have to ask that question. But remembering, this inquest didn't finish for Polly Nichols until after the Annie Chapman crime. So by the time the police really would have started deep diving their investigation, because they did talk to Lechmere, he appeared at the inquest a couple of days after this crime as well. But could they have nailed him for all the others? Well, that would have been very, very difficult for the reasons I've already discussed. So he could easily just slip off the radar. But if they were looking at this crime in isolation, well, he'd be top of the list. You'd have to go through him like a dose of salts. Now, it's possible it was a similar situation to James Sadler. They may have had strong suspicion, but knowing they didn't have the evidence at the time. And then when the other crimes started happening, they probably found evidence to say, well, he couldn't have done those. So then he gets away with this one. Similar to Joe Barnett. Obvious suspect for Mary Kelly, but you can't pin him for the others. And the police, after the Mary Kelly crime, were quick to say that Jack the Ripper hysteria is over, even though the crimes kept happening. The police themselves said that they knew who the perpetrator was, and a couple of the police said that we warned the person. We couldn't convict them, but we told them we're watching you, and the crimes ceased. Well, a couple of people disappeared, as we've said. I personally think there was a greater reason as to why the police were trying to shut down this hysteria, partly because the public were very much on edge and it was possibly going to lead to almost a full revolution. So to sum up, I feel that the investigation was hampered because they were trying to pin these 5 crimes to one person, and I think that still happens today. Whereas the crimes really should be looked at in isolation, and if then the connections can be made between them, then absolutely. But there was at least 4 people after the first 2 crimes against Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman that were either incarcerated or locked up, but then when later crimes happened, even though there was good evidence to suggest they could have been involved in those first 2 crimes, they said, well, you can't have done those ones, out you go. To me, that just is really strange. Now, what do you think? Now, there's 3 options here. Firstly, that I am totally wrong, and you know what? That is a possibility. Some of you out there would be saying, no, there is strong evidence to pin one bloke to all of these crimes. That's not that hard to do. Well, let me know down in comments. It's also possible that the police knew who perpetrated all of these crimes, and it may have been different individuals, but because they couldn't get convictions, they just kept that to themselves. And now those records have been lost. Or you might agree with me. You might say, you know what, Owen, that makes a lot of sense. And so then I would say this. Instead of needing an inquest into one particular suspect, I would suggest there should be an inquest into each of these crimes individually, looking at all the surrounding people, evidence, and circumstances, and then seeing if there is a common thread amongst them all that could definitely get proven. Because otherwise, I feel it's trying to pull circumstantial evidence and make one person look guilty, which I believe is quite easy to do. I'm going to investigate that in the next video, so look out for that one. But let me know down in comments what you think. If I've gone totally off the path, or you go, well, Owen gave me something to think about, thank you very much. And if this, I think this could be a bit of a long one, so thank you for hanging around to the end. And if you are a new viewer here and you've got this far, then just remember that here at the Pub Test, we share our opinions. We can have strong opinions, but we keep everything nice and respectful in comments. And thank you to all who are sharing these videos in the various locations. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.